Welcome to a special episode of Being Human. I'm your host, Steve Cuss. Once in a while, we pause our guests and our tools, and we take a look at a movie or a TV show. Today, we're taking a look at The Bear, TV show The Bear. It's mostly featured on Hulu. A couple of things right off. This really is designed for those of you familiar with The Bear, but also if you've never watched the show, there's a lot you can get out of this, because actually I'll be pulling out 7 core themes, systems theory themes, anxiety theory themes that we can all be looking at, not only on The Bear, but in our own lives. So even if you're not familiar with The Bear, you'll get something out of this, but this really is designed for fans of the show. Just briefly, if you are listening to this or watching this because you love The Bear and maybe someone sent this to you, I'm Steve Cuss. I have this podcast, Being Human. We focus particularly on a type of anxiety called chronic anxiety. Chronic anxiety is fascinating. It's the only anxiety that's contagious. It's an anxiety that is based on false belief and false needs. You know, some anxieties are true. Like, for example, acute anxiety, when you're actually in danger, that's based on something real. But chronic anxiety is a very common anxiety that humans carry, and we spread it to each other and we catch it from each other. So a lot of the work I do on Being Human is helping us to notice and name and diffuse chronic anxiety. So we're not spreading it and catching it so much. And so we're not living out of false assumptions, but rather we're living in something true. Among many other things, I'm a pastor. My primary vocation in life is to help people connect to God. And I have found it profoundly helpful to teach people the science of chronic anxiety, because it is one of the things that blocks our awareness of God. So on this episode, it's kind of a two-parter in this one episode. We'll start by just giving a general overview of The Bear, the main plot, the main characters, some of the things that are going on. And then the back half of this episode will be 7 anxiety dynamics that you can notice both on the show, but also in your own life. Every time we do an episode on Being Human, we light a candle, which for those of you listening is kind of funny because you don't get to see it. If you're with us on YouTube, you get to see it. But because God's invisible, and because we get caught up in ourselves with our chronic anxiety, it can be hard to remember the Lord. So every episode we just pause and we just take a breath. We watch the candle, or we listen for the candle, and we relax into God's presence. Let's do that now. Okay, so The Bear. It's a restaurant show set in Chicago. It's a fiction, urban Chicago. It features the main character, Kami, or Carmine. He is this young, extremely talented, high-end chef. He's clearly been trained in some of the best restaurants in the world. And he's returned back home to Chicago from traveling abroad and training abroad because his older brother died. His older brother, Michael, had a Chicago sandwich shop in downtown Chicago. They basically served what's called a beef, a classic. What's interesting is I actually didn't know this about this sandwich, but Chicago is not only known for its deep dish pizzas, it's also known for a particular kind of sandwich called the beef. And actually the restaurant that Kami takes over is called The Beef. And it's a very grimy, quick, in and out, kind of rough and tumble restaurant. The conditions are pretty rough. The kitchen is disgusting. The staff are pretty rough. And Kami comes in to take over. It's not a spoiler, but the restaurant's in terrible shape in every way. Mismanaged. Financially, it's about broke. But also the tragedy that kind of underlies the thing is Kami's older brother had taken his life. So even in the first episode, there's a lot of anxiety flying around. Now, the whole kind of plot movement of The Bear is Kami, this essentially very talented, highly skilled, world-class chef, slowly turns this cheap lunch shop into a high-class restaurant. What's fascinating about it is he essentially uses the same staff. So he slowly converts this blue-collar, fast food mentality staff into a fine dining staff. the show, I would say in some ways, the main driver of the show is anxiety. That's what first got me so interested in it. In fact, I'll just confess, I almost didn't make it through the first 3 episodes. There is so much anxiety coming off the screen at you that it's kind of hard to watch at first. There's a lot of conflict. I tend to be conflict avoidant, so when I'm watching a lot of conflict, it gets me a bit triggered. So definitely a triggering show. Let's see. It's called The Bear because Kami kind of has this raging bear inside of him, like inside of his soul. He's never calm. He's very jittery. He's a super intense guy. He's profoundly anxious. He shakes. He gets headaches. He self-sabotages. He has outbursts at other people. A couple of things I do want to comment on. The show has a tremendous amount of crude language, almost I would call it like an onslaught of crude language. You kind of have to decide your own tolerance for, what you are comfortable watching and exposing yourself to. It's funny. I'm actually kind of a prude when it comes to language. And so their use of language and the frequency of it is definitely an assault on me. So just a fair warning about the show. But if you haven't watched it, there's a lot going for it. It's a phenomenal study in contagious anxiety. It's a great show to watch to notice system theory patterns, anxiety patterns. I've got 7 that I'm going to get into here in a couple of minutes. But also, aside from the fact that the acting is superb, the cast is superb, the plot and the story is captivating. Aside from that, the showrunner's use of music, cinematography, just the way they can create a mood with a lens focus, with an angle, with the music, it's stunning. So far, as the recording of this episode, there's been 3 seasons, and season 3, the first episode of season 3, there was no dialogue. Like the whole episode was just a mood of music and visuals, telling this amazing backstory of how Kami got his training. Absolutely mesmerizing. But also, quite often during the show, like any good showrunner, sometimes there'll be a metaphor that goes all the way through that episode. So, for example, there's a particular episode where Kami is clearly about to blow a fuse emotionally. He's getting more and more anxious. You can see he's about to blow. And as he is unloading on his staff, the actual restaurant blows a physical electrical fuse at the same time. And even just the cinematography of Kami versus like the pinball machine about to blow is really a nice touch. Also, the show gives you some fun vocabulary in your relationships. My wife and I now often say to each other, heard. It's one of the things that they say in the show. If they're talking to each other, one of them will acknowledge and just say heard, like I hear you. Behind, if you're coming behind a chef because there's a lot going on. And yes, chef. It's kind of a classic kitchen show like that. Okay, let's get into some main characters. So we have Kami, the young talented chef. We have his cousin Richie, who, as we come to find out later, is not a blood cousin. Richie's a cousin because when he was a little boy, he had nowhere else to go. And so Kami's family kind of took him in. Interesting little aside, Richie and Kami's deceased brother, best friends. There's a lot there. Kami's sister, Natalie. So it's really Kami and Richie and Natalie that run the restaurant. Kami runs the kitchen. Richie supposedly runs the front of house, the waiting, the serving. Natalie runs the books and the business. They have an uncle, Jimmy, and he is the money. He's very wealthy. He's kind of got mafia overtones, actually. Okay, the young assistant chef is Sydney. Then Marcus is the dessert chef. And then we have Tina and Ibrahim, who are also working in the kitchen. So when Kami comes and takes over in the very first episode, he already has Richie, he already has Marcus, Tina, and Ibrahim. And then Sydney walks in off the street and asks for a job because she's a big fan of Kami. She's familiar with his work and she wants to learn from him. There's others as well. There's Neil Fack and some other characters as well, but that's the core of the show. And one of the things that makes the show beautiful is watching all of these characters, how they get along, how they spread and catch anxiety, but also how each of them go on their own growth journey, how each of them, for better or worse, face their own anxiety and try to navigate it. Okay, 7 big themes, and I'm going to pull these out really quickly. This will be fairly brief, but I'm pulling them out to help you and I notice these in our life as well. Theme number 1, not new to any of my Being Human audience. Anxiety is contagious. That's the theme. Anxiety is contagious. I don't know how else to say it. If you can learn to notice the spread of anxiety, you are so much less likely to catch it and spread it. It's like just noticing as a superpower. And so as you're watching the bear, just noticing the escalation of anxiety is the most powerful thing you can do to not be one of the people that are escalating it. And there's some very simple things that you can notice. Number 1, who is spreading it? Or another way to say it, who is the most anxious person in the room right now? Next time you're in a staff meeting, next time you're in a group of friends, next time you're at a family gathering, who's the most anxious person in the room right now? Now, where this gets really interesting is when you notice, I'm the most anxious person in the room. I've had that happen a few times. Okay, so who's spreading it? Then, of course, the second question, who's carrying it? Oftentimes when I'm doing organizational assessments, sometimes an organization will have me come in and work with the key leaders. I'm looking at who's the one that tends to spread the anxiety, who are the ones that tend to carry the anxiety, and then a third interesting question, what micro adjustments are everybody making to keep everything the same? Usually by the time someone like me is called in, these anxiety patterns are pretty deep-seated in a company or a ministry or a church. And my job is to help dislodge the stuck patterns, but it almost always comes down to the simple rule that the minority of the people are generating the majority of the anxiety. So once you can start to notice who's generating it and who's catching it, even if you're in the system, you can now make the decision, okay, as much as it depends on me, I will no longer be escalating. I'm going to work on not contributing to the anxiety spiral. And also as others spiral, I'm going to try to be present without catching it. Much easier said than done, but a really powerful tool. And so on the bear, right out of the gate, you see that Kami and Richie, for example, lots of anxiety spreading between the two of them. But also Richie and most people he works with, Richie's a very anxious person. Kami and most of the people he works with, Kami's a very anxious person. Lots of anxiety going on in the bear, which leads us to our second major takeaway. None of us escape our family of origin. Every one of us have a family of origin. And whether we realize it or not, whether we want to or not, we tend to carry our family of origin into our workplace and into all of our relationships. And there's a particular episode in season 2 called 7 Fishes, one of the most anxious hours of television I've ever watched. It's a family Christmas dinner. It's a flashback episode. Kami and Natalie, his sister, and Richie, his cousin, and Michael, his older brother, who's dead in the current time. When you flash back, they're all still adults, but they're all having a Christmas dinner with their mum, played amazingly by Jamie Lee Curtis. By the way, just as an aside, that Christmas dinner and the special guests around the guest actors around that table, Bob Odenkirk from Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad is there. Of course, Oliver Platt, who's a regular on the show, but also John Mulaney, the comedian. Man, that Christmas table is stacked with guest stars, including the legendary Jamie Lee Curtis. And Jamie Lee Curtis is the mum in this family of origin. And this is where you really start to discover, this is why Richie's so anxious. This is why Michael is so anxious. This is why Kami is so anxious. Because in this family of origin, the mother generates all the anxiety and the kids carry it. This is where you start to see Natalie, the sister, enmeshed with her mother. When mum ain't happy, ain't nobody happy. And so Natalie is sacrificing herself and her own well-being in order to try to keep mum stable. Again, some of you have lived this. Some of you are in enmeshed relationships with your family of origin where if a key family member, particularly if it's a mom or a dad, is dysregulated, then you feel responsible to regulate them. Now, I don't say that to blame. Sometimes that's how you survived, and that's fine. But you're an adult now, and you carry those childhood coping mechanisms with you into adulthood. Have you ever noticed that? Like maybe you were around, let's say that you grew up with a really angry dad and he would just dump his anger on the family, and you had learned to shapeshift to appease your dad. And now you're an adult and you find yourself around like a aggressive man and you become an 8-year-old again, even though you're an adult. So one of the great things you could do, you could watch the Seven Fishes episode of The Bear, season 2, look at family of origin dynamics, but really what you're trying to do is get to terms with your own assets and liabilities of your family of origin. What assets have you inherited? What liabilities are you carrying? Maybe another way to say it is, what liabilities are tossing you around? What liabilities are carrying you? Have you by a grip? And what work can you do to sift your family of origin through the gospel of Jesus? What work can you do to give thanks for the way you were raised, but also to really reflect on some of the ways you were raised that are not serving you well, that are keeping you bound? So, family of origin, it's a big part of The Bear. And this particular episode, the Christmas episode, a dear friend of mine, Brian, he reached out to me after watching it. He said, in all my years of watching television, this is the first time in my life I've had to turn off an episode because I couldn't handle the anxiety. It's so crazy. Okay, dynamic number 3 we're pulling out. Triangulation makes things more anxious. Triangulated relationships, these are really common. It's most keenly seen in season 3 of The Bear. One of the earlier episodes, Richie and Kami are not doing well together. They're sort of cousins, and they butt heads a lot. And the way they both butt heads is they both get bigger. You know, sometimes when people are in a fight, somebody gets bigger and someone gets smaller, and it kind of works, even though oftentimes the smaller person tends to get run over. But fights that are really hard is when both parties, their attempted solution to the fight is just to get bigger, and then they just have to escalate and escalate. That's Kami and Richie. And in one very absurd moment in season 3, they're triangulating Sydney, this young assistant chef, in between them. When people don't have the maturity to work out their own issues between two people, they will drag in a third person to help manage the anxiety or diffuse the anxiety. The problem is it always makes it worse. And so you can watch it in season 3. It gets really childish, where even though Richie is right in front of Kami doesn't talk to Richie. Kami talks triangulated to Sydney. Kami says, Sydney, can you tell Richie this? And they're all just standing right there. It's absurd. And then Richie replies, Sydney, can you tell Kami this? And back and forth they go. Reminds me of middle school relationships where James, and Sally are talking, and Sally says, hey, James, do you like Cindy? Because if you do, I'll tell her, right? Like middle school crushes are never dealt with directly. They're always dealt with mobs and posses. That's triangulation. Gossip is almost always triangulation. And you have to be so careful with triangulation because in the short term, it feels good to vent to someone, to pull someone in. And listen, in defense, sometimes it really is helpful to get another point of view. But if you are in the habit of dragging someone else in to manage your relationship with a third party, it's just going to make you more anxious. It might feel better in the short term, but it doesn't make anything better in the long term. And so lots of triangulated relationships going on in The Bear. That's a dynamic you can be looking out for. All right. The fourth dynamic, and this is a more positive one, this is the reason I keep watching The Bear, is because of these human moments. The fourth dynamic, being seen is a path to becoming human-sized. One of the times we get anxious is when we're misunderstood or misjudged or maligned. I know in my life, one of the biggest triggers for me is when somebody willfully misunderstands me. I get really anxious if I feel misunderstood or if my motives are questioned. the opposite of that is when somebody sees me for exactly who I am. And not only my favorite episode of The Bear, but one of my favorite episodes of television in all of my television watching history is called Forks. It's season 2. It happens to be right after the Christmas episode. After the massive anxiety of the Christmas episode where there's fights and chaos and it's just crazy and it's escalating, you go to the next episode and everything's relaxed. Kami is in the habit of sending his team to get trained in these fine restaurants. So these blue-collar fast food workers get to spend sometimes a week, sometimes several weeks, training in these fine restaurants. And so Kami sends Richie to one of the best restaurants in Chicago. The head chef is Olivia Colman. Many of you know her because she plays Queen Elizabeth on The Crown. And this is this 5-star restaurant. This is one of those restaurants you save every penny and you go out for a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And Richie, for really the first time in the whole show, is seen. He's seen by the waitstaff. He's seen by the head chef. He's seen by the head kind of, I don't know her title, but the lady that runs the chefs as they're getting all the meals out. And not only is he seen, but that frees him up to see. I don't want to make too much of this, but when we are on guard, when we are protecting ourselves from whatever's coming at us, we don't see. We don't see what's really going on. But when we are seen by others, that frees us to be human-sized. And now we can see what's really going on. And Richie, by this point in the show, is really quite combative and defensive, but this is really the first time he lets his guard down and he becomes exactly himself, which, as it turns out, is a first-class maitre d'. He goes from this combative fast food, I don't care about anything, just get it done, do the sloppy, do it the cheapest way, the simplest way, to suddenly really, really caring about the customer experience. He discovers at this fine restaurant the joy of doing something for a customer that they'll never forget for their whole life. And he gets so excited about it. For those of you who are familiar with The Bear, it's just so satisfying that after a week in this fine dining restaurant, he returns back to the Bear restaurant wearing a suit. And every day now for the rest of the show, he dresses up in a suit because he now has self-respect and he wants to present a professional experience to his customers. And the whole next episode, I mean, it really made me tear up watching him do it as the blue-collar workers are looking at him now in his fine suit, and he simply says to them this wonderful phrase. He said it over and over. He just said, "I wear suits now. I wear suits now," which was like a metaphor for I'm a changed person. One of my most favorite episodes of human transformation ever is Forks. But it all started with him being seen. And this is something, I know you and I, we crave to be seen. But really, the reason I'm bringing this up is so you and I can be thinking about who needs to be seen. Who in our life needs to be seen. I know as a parent, my earlier parenting, I was so hung up on my kids' behavior, I struggled to see them. And I learned, honestly, mostly from my wife, how can I see my kids through their behavior? I hope, as people who worked for me, that they were in the regular habit of feeling seen by me, that I understood, I listened to understand, I listened to encourage, because I believe that when somebody feels seen, they can change the world. They are their best self. That's the fourth dynamic. So we've done 4 out of the 7. The first one is the simple idea that anxiety is contagious. The second one is our family of origin forms us more than we realize. The third one, triangulation makes things more anxious. The fourth one, being seen, is a path to being human-sized. The fifth one, this is a simple anxiety diffusing tool. Debrief the anxiety back when you're connected. Let me say that maybe a little better. Debrief the anxiety once you're connected again. The show does a pretty good job of this. Oftentimes there's all kinds of fights and conflict, particularly between Kami and his young assistant chef, Sydney. Sydney has all of this ambition to create a great restaurant, and Kami sometimes lets her be his partner, and sometimes she's very much his subordinate. And she is starting to notice these predictable patterns in Kami that even though he says that she's a partner, he treats her like a subordinate. She starts to notice that actually he always gets the last word. It's not, in fact, a discussion. And they end up in conflict with each other. And oftentimes they are not their best with each other, and their fights are pretty bad. And then afterwards, they have developed a simple signal with each other, which is just a fist rubbing their chest. They just rub their chest, and that's a signal to each other, I'm sorry, I would like a do-over. Now, that's very simple on the bear, but something that you can do if you are not happy with the way you acted towards somebody. The temptation is to pretend you didn't, or ignore it, or just say, oh, well, that's weird. But actually, there's so much power in simply calling them and debriefing the moment. The secret to it is waiting until you're reconnected. If you debrief while you're anxious, it's just going to get worse. But debriefing after the fact and just calling and saying, I don't like the way I handled our encounter. Could we try again? It's crazy. We have a coach in our organization, Renee, and she's famous for this. She'll actually sometimes say to somebody, would you leave the room and walk back in? I would like a second chance to do better. It's great. And then the person's like, what? And then they'll walk back in the room and they'll literally have the conversation again, but now she's grounded and well. So dynamic number 5 from the bear, debrief the anxiety when you're connected. 2 more to go. Number 6, memories are unreliable. This is big. This is deep. Memories are unreliable. The older we get, the more we start to realize how unreliable our memories are, because our memories are attached to the meaning that we've made from an experience. And so, we think our memories are like a video snapshot of what happened, but actually they're a fairly subjective interpretation of what happened. And we see this most keenly in season 3 of The Bear, because that's the season where we get the most flashbacks into Kami's training. And what we learn is that Kami trained, I believe, I had trouble counting, at either 3 or 4 world-class restaurants. He trained with Olivia Colman in Chicago at this restaurant where he sent Richie. He trained at the famous French Laundry with Thomas Keller. What's neat about the show is sometimes famous chefs play themselves on the show, and so we get to see Kami training with Thomas Keller. I believe, if I'm following it right, he trained in Copenhagen in Denmark, which is also where he sent Marcus, his pastry and dessert chef, to go get trained. And then he got trained in New York City by this very cruel and abusive chef. Now, what's interesting, I'm pretty sure it was 4 different chefs that trained him, all of them world-class. 3 of the 4 were very gentle with Kami, very encouraging to him, and ran a calm kitchen. In fact, there's a great scene where Kami loses it in his training and yells at the other chefs, and the head chef comes in and just very gently says to him, we don't do that here. She didn't even tell him off. She actually called him to their values. And she said, no, we have a calm kitchen. We're a culture of encouragement. So as you go back and see Kami's flashbacks, you discover that 75% of the head chefs he trained under are wonderful human beings that gave him an incredible gift and their blessing and encouragement. 25% of the chefs he trained under, this one guy, abusive and cruel. Now, what do you think Kami most remembers? And what gets interesting in the show is, what does Kami most impersonate? The abusive and the cruel chef. Kami begins to replicate the abuse that the chef put him under. He starts to mistreat his staff. He calls them things. He says things that you can't take back once you've said them. In fact, one of my personal disappointments with season 3 is how little Kami grows through the season. You look at his behavior and you're like, man, look at what was poured into you and look at the way you're acting. Now, I don't know if you've noticed this. Sometimes it's easiest to notice with like musicians and actors because, the music industry, the acting industry, any kind of arts involves a lot of rejection. Even authors can do this. Sometimes they'll say things like, everyone told me I couldn't do it, but I did it. Nobody believed in me, but I had to press on. They'll use these extreme languages like, everywhere I went, the doors closed. Everyone, nobody. When probably that's not accurate. It's probably true that they faced rejection. It's probably true that some people had difficult things to say to them. But what's also probably true, there were probably people in their life who said, you can do this, you're good at this. But their memory looks back and only focuses on the rejection. Now, you probably know that our brains are kind of wired to give more weight to the negative than the positive, almost like, I think it's like a 7-fold number. The reason I bring this up is you had this amazing opportunity to go back into some of your painful memories and sift them, figure out maybe not so much if they're true or not, but the meaning you have made about your current situation and about the future. This is the problem with some of our negative memories, some of our painful memories, is we live out of them in a way that we protect ourselves from future potential hurt, and so we are disconnected. And this is really what we see in Kami. And right toward the end of season 3, he starts to realize he's becoming the very thing that he hates the most. And can he change? That's kind of the cliffhanger we're on right now. The final dynamic is in some ways the most serious one. I think all of us, I think the journey of maturity, spiritual maturity, we have to wrangle the things that we live for that are destroying us and destroying our precious relationships. Some of us are living for something that's killing us. We see this with Kami when he and Sydney, his assistant chef, they start to set the menu. And Sydney had created a great menu. In fact, Kami had kind of asked her to start developing some menu ideas. And then he met with her and he changed every item she'd created, very demoralizing for her. And she starts to question. She actually does a good job of using curiosity rather than fighting him. She uses curiosity to ask him about the menu. And he says, I actually wrote this down. He says, so they can see what we're capable of. And she just wisely asks, who's they? She's like, why are we changing the menu? And he's very anxious. So they can see what we're capable of. And she follows up with another curious question, who's they? And we start to realize that Kami is living to win the approval of someone that he'll never get the approval of. This mysterious they. One of the deeper tools I teach in my work is the giants on your shoulders, figuring out who do you have on your shoulders who are looking at you and judging you? Who are you trying to please that maybe you'll either never be able to please because maybe these people in real life are dead, or maybe there's nothing you can do to make them happy, or maybe you have turned them into giants when really they're human-sized. In your imagination, they're harsh taskmasters. This scene gets really poignant because not only is all of Sydney's hard work just dismissed by Kami, not only is she overrun, but he then puts her under tremendous pressure when he says, this isn't the menu forever. This is today's menu. Every day we're going to have a new menu. He has this incessant need to prove himself. He must have a Michelin star for him to be okay. This is what I want to close on as we're talking about the bear, because what's interesting is some people believe that we have to be anxious to be productive, that we have to have this interior, unquenchable desire for excellence in order to be productive. It's not true. You look at somebody, let's talk about like a Yo-Yo Ma. Now, Yo-Yo Ma, the world's finest classical musician alive today, one of the finest cello players in all of history. Yes, it's true. He's been playing since he was a little boy. It's true. He practices a lot. But when you watch him play or when you listen to his interviews, that man is free. He is not incessantly on the treadmill to please someone that he'll never please. he is operating out of, who he is, his giftedness and being human sized. If you've ever seen him play cello, it is, for me, a worshipful experience because he's so alive when he plays cello. It makes me feel human. So it's not true that we have to have this broken thing in us. We have to live for this destructive thing in order for us to produce excellence. What is actually true is we can be human-sized, and that frees us to be beautifully productive. And we see in the bear that Kami's untamed ambition is destroying him. It's destroying his relationship with his girlfriend. It's destroying his relationship with the staff at the restaurant. And it's also like just causing incredible damage everywhere he goes. But if only he could realize he's incredibly talented. He has the skill. He has what it takes. He doesn't have to incessantly chase it. So this is the final invitation from this episode. Is there something that you are chasing that has you consumed? Is there something that's just out of reach that you just keep trying and trying and trying? You're never getting it. Are there people on your shoulders that you are trying to receive their blessing and you never will? One of the great tragedies of Jacob in the Old Testament, Jacob and Esau, Jacob fundamentally believed he had to be somebody else in order to be blessed. And really his journey of grace, his wrestling with God, was the discovery that he can be exactly himself and be blessed by God. Okay, so that's the Being Human episode on the bear. If this was helpful to you, or if you know somebody who loves the bear, would you do me a favor and share this episode with them? We would really like to get the word out about being human and help get it into more hands, and you can help us with that. So maybe you know somebody who loves the bear, maybe you're in a conversation, just send them this episode. That would mean a great deal. And also, we'll be doing more bonus episodes on the screen, a TV show or a movie. If there's one that you want me to watch or Lisa and I to watch and analyze, just tag me on Twitter at Steve Cusswords or on Instagram, the same handle. And then I'll find that and we'll see about watching that show, and maybe we'll do a feature episode of your show as well. Thanks for joining us on Being Human. See you next time.